The Magic Ward. Chapter 1. Between the Cracks, Another World. A young, fair-skinned girl looks upon the falling snow outside her window. Her green eyes gaze out into the forest, squinting at every subtle movement. Her brown hair curves and twists around her, framing her face in an almost portrait-like way. Her full lips pierce and pucker with every passing thought. Every so often, she twirls with the bottom of her green shimmering tank top and pulls at her plain boxers that are rolled up to fit her small frame. She is non-existent to the world around her, wiggling every so often on her window seat. The dark wood in the log cabin makes every bit of her appearance extend into something almost magical. However, she just keeps staring out into the snow, as if something will just appear. And then suddenly, slam! She looks fast behind her to see a young man, tall and rugged with middle-length brown, messy hair, and amber eyes standing at the doorway. "Jaden! Where have you been?" At work, sweetie? Is this a trick question?" He looks at her playfully and flashes a dazzling smirk. She stands up looking at him angrily and rolls her eyes. "You know what I mean! You expect me to believe you're at work for nearly 2 days?" Jaden walked over to her and tried to hold her with his muscular arms, but she smacked them away, disgusted by his advance. "Lyera, come on, you know how bad the roads are around this time." He holds out his arms once more and gives her another one of his beautiful smiles. And this time, Lyera lets him embrace her. "Now, what did you make me for dinner, sweetie?" "You're such an asshole!" Lyera pushes him away and lets her fist come up into the air, and she could feel her fingertips tingling, a sensation that usually happens when she is excited or angry, and then she stops. "You fucking prick." She lets her hand drop, keeping it into a tight little fist. She turns around, not letting the man she loves see the tears piling up in her eyes, and runs into her bedroom. Her face covered in tears, she lets herself fall into the pillows, where she lay still. "Hello?" A voice rang out, almost piercing in the silence of a non-existent dream. "Hello?" Lyera looked up. Her eyes tried adjusting, but there was nothing to see. Nothing was there, no walls, no floor, no ceiling, just the dark. "Lyera?" The voice called out again. Somehow this familiar, beautiful voice knew she was there, even in the darkness. "What? Is there something you need? Who are you?" Lyera was floating in a black sea of nothing. She wore a white dress that hung to her feet and moved gracefully with every jerk and pull of her body. "Hello?" "Lyera, do you remember yet?" The voice grew stronger. It echoed in Lyera's ears, making it even more difficult to pick out any particular place this wonderfully calm voice was coming from, for it seemed like the voice was coming from everywhere. Lyera tried to look at her surroundings once more, but only saw darkness once again. She could feel heavy pressure surrounding her body. Her voice became fainter as she tried to speak. Her cries for the voice to return only were recognized as a whisper or a small moan. Her breath became shorter. She could feel her lungs gasping for air, but no air was there to be acquired. She began to panic. Her body jerked more severely, tussling her hair and dress around her, getting her caught and making her unable to move. She could feel herself fading away from everything. From the dream, from the voice, from Jaden. She could see it happening. She could see it happening, but could do nothing about it. She gave one last flail with her ligaments. Lyera then gasped for air, holding herself up by her fragile arms. Looking down, she could see her pillow drenched in sweat. Her hair was draped around her neck, and her blanket entangled her feet. She quickly pushed the blanket off of her, and she fell back down into the pillow. About to fall asleep, she heard a familiar voice coming from the kitchen. She sat up, inching her way toward the door. "Is she ready yet?" the deep, almost seductive male voice asked. "Listen, I can't rush these things," Jaden said. Lyera could hear the tension in his voice. It shook almost at every syllable. This was strange, because even when he got into any type of argument, he never stood down, was never afraid. And now you could hear the tension in his voice, just because of a simple man. "Well, you could help her at least remember her own spells!" the man yelled. His voice trembled with anger, and it made Lyra's heart sink. "She's almost," Jaden started to say meekly, his voice trembling yet again. "Shh," the man interrupted Jaden. His voice sank into a smooth, deep hush. "We have company." Lyra inched further away from the door, hoping the man wasn't talking about her. She kept moving back until she fell over her bed. Her body shook while she sat there, waiting for a good time to go back and listen to the intense conversation again. She kept her eyes on the door. Her heart stopped pounding after a couple minutes of watching and waiting. She got up the courage to stand up on her own feet, but as soon as she did, the door slammed open. Lyra let out a small scream, but she pulled herself together almost immediately. Her eyes glanced at the strange man. His eyes were harsh and yellow like a snake, and he wore a green shimmering cloak while holding a staff about his height. The staff wasn't impressive in height, as was the man, but the design on the staff had an intricate design of almost a Celtic ancestry. Lyra almost laughed, thinking that this short, dwarfish man was a thing that scared her. Lyra scowled and looked down at the man, who looked like a living, breathing statuette from a medieval board game, and said, "What are you doing barging into my room like that? Don't you know how rude that is?" "Yes, my dear." He looked up smiling. The voice took her aback. She could hear the seduction coming from this frigid old man, but it just didn't match his demeanor. Her thoughts became distracted, and she had to look at this spindly old man's face just to keep her mind off of his voice. "But you were the one who barged into our conversation first." She stayed focused on this man's face. "How could you know what I was doing?" The man laughed, a sweet melody, and went straight back into the kitchen. Lyra ran after him, infuriated that this disgusting creature could hypnotize her. But when she got to the doorway of her kitchen, she couldn't move. The man burst into laughter, and she could see his face being disfigured into something beautiful. "Such a fool! How is it that you're such a great spellmaker, and you can't even see a spell that's right under your nose? Oh, how beautiful!" The man's face got put back together into the bark-shaped substance it was. "Since you cannot talk, I'll just tell you. My name is Rioness. You're trapped by an entrapment spell. As you can tell by the name, you're not going anywhere. And sadly enough, you aren't going to be in this world very long either. You're going back to where you were born, back to where you're meant to be. Enjoy." With that, Rioness waved his age-ridden hands in front of his face and became a tall, handsome, white-haired man. His face matched his figure all right, lean and graceful. His clothes fit to his body, making him look like a prince of sorts. He began to smile, his teeth perfect, and his lips tightly placed over them made Lyra's knees weak. His hands moved in a circular motion, showing off a giant raven-shaped ring with jewels placed upon the center of each talon, covering the entire man's finger. Bye. The man disappeared, and Lyra began sinking into the floor of the doorway, as if it were merely quicksand. Lyra looked up at Jaden, confused and trying to understand the conversation she really barged into. "Jaden! Help me!" she yelled, but Jaden just stared at her coldly, making no attempt to help. "Jaden! Please!" She could feel the floor surrounding her ankles. "Jaden!" He just kept gazing at her, his face making no emotion, no twitch telling Lyra that he even cared. Her heart fell as if there was nothing to catch it. "Jaden?" Her voice became weak, and sobs of pain and sorrow wrinkled her brow. She could feel the floor hugging her hips, squeezing her tightly, but she could feel her toes now free. It seemed like they were dangling. "Jaden?" she sobbed. "Are you going to do something?" Jaden stared, finally a twitch of sorrow, but he turned away, hiding his pain. "I'm off to work now." Jaden grabbed his coat, keeping his eyes away from hers, as if he was also crying. "I'll see you later. Don't wait up for me this time, okay?" He chuckled weakly, and left, leaving Lyra alone and terrified. "Jaden! You can't leave me here like this!" She began to feel the floor at her breast. Her breath became shortened by the pressure. Able to move now, she pushed up with her arms against the floor to get her out, but the floor began to take those as well until she pulled them successfully out and above her head in hopes Jaden would grab them and save her. The floor clung to her shoulders now. She could feel her legs dangling in some unknown place. She tried stretching her feet to find ground, but there was nothing. The floor wrapped around her throat. She tightened her lips and started to breathe out her nose, just in time for the floor to consume her mouth as well. She breathed in deeply through her nose, and the floor rose above, taking away her ability to breathe completely. She began to wait now. As the floor slowly let her sink, she could feel it climbing her body more and more, and releasing it as she went down. She could barely hold on to her breath, but knew she had to. The floor has already released her shoulders, and she could feel herself dangling. Finally, it uncovered her mouth, and she took a long gasp for air. It slowly released her head, and now she was only being held by her arms. Able to see, she looked at her unknown surroundings. She looked down and only saw darkness. It looked like she was hanging from a ceiling of some sort, and she could see giant cylinder columns in rows around her. She tried following them down, looking for the floor, but they just melted into the darkness, as if to go on and on forever. Now her hands were the only things in the ceiling. She felt her weight against her wrists and let out a small moan of pain. Her body sank more, and her fingers were the only thing inside the ceiling. She could feel them pop as her weight began to feel heavier and heavier. Then suddenly, her fingers slipped from the ceiling, and Lyera was now falling. She tried to look at her surroundings more, but now that the ceiling was out of sight, she could only see columns. And after a couple of seconds of falling, she could see the floor coming faster and faster upon her. She clenched her body, only to feel herself stop completely. She opened her eyes to see the floor not even 2 feet away. Then her whole body dropped onto the ground.